So welcome on this beautiful day. I've got the great pleasure of hosting two amazing human beings today. I would say that this is a mix of the strongest and the smartest, if I could put it uh, very succinctly. Um, Professor McGill needs no introduction. He is one of the greatest experts on spine biomechanics and injury mechanisms to date. Um, he has been a great mentor and friend over the years. And Brian Carroll is one of the strongest and quite smart individuals in the powerlifting world. I'm really grateful and really honored to have you two here to share your experience and to speak about your new book, which we were just very lucky to publish last year with Galactica in Poland. DAR KONTUZJI is the Polish version of the original Gift of Injury. And so, welcome, gentlemen. Nice to have you here.
Thank you, Pavel. Appreciate it.
Yeah, dzień dobry, Paweł. Jak się masz?
Dzień dobry. Mam się dobrze, mamy się super. Dziękuję. Super. Great to have you guys here again. Thank you so much. Where to start? First of all, it's amazing looking at this book. Every single time I look at this book, I really feel that it was put together by a PhD level professor and an elite athlete. And what I really love about this work is that it is truly a fusion of art and science. And what I mean by that is there's an actual program for training here, step-by-step, detailed approach, but there's also assessment, and there's also understanding of the individual and the importance of working with that individual. That is something that I really want to focus on here today. When I looked at the book today earlier, I saw that section 1 was the story of the athlete, the professor, the injury, and the search for a solution. Section 2 was basically BackFit Pro methodology as I know it, pain recovery protocols, assessment, and then section 3 was tuning the training program, the art and science of it all. Section 4 was how to train, and technique cues and tips, which were quite wonderful. I've been fascinated by strength for a really long time, maybe because I don't have it. My parents were a gymnast and a elite endurance athlete, and so I don't have exactly the software and hardware for strength. I've never really had great strength, but I've been really obsessed by it and really fascinated by it, and I've always wanted it. On my pursuits, I've learned from places like the Conjugate System, Westside Barbell, Louis Simmons. I've done their courses. I was also fortunate enough to take a 3-day course with Louis Simmons, Matt Wenning, Ed Cohen, and Charles Poliquin. That was really eye-opening and fascinating. And further to this, I've learned from you, Professor Stu, and Brian indirectly through your books and your stories. So one of my first questions that I wanted to get into here for today was the concept of the spectrum. So we have on one end elite athletic competency, and on the other end we have therapy, and one needs the other. And what really fascinates me about both of you guys is that you started somewhere completely different than where you ended up. Whereas you both ended up in the coaching and the clinic environment. Professor Stu, I believe you started with studying athleticism and injury mechanisms, and then you ended up in the lab quantifying injury mechanisms, and then now you're coaching and working in a clinic mainly. Whereas Brian, you had started as an athlete, a lifelong athlete. You got injured, you went through the process of recovery, and you ended up pretty much in the same place coaching and helping others get over their pain and live really strong, healthy, and valuable lives. So could you each speak to that a little bit?
Go ahead, Stu. We got beauty before age.
Lovely. Well, I see it this way. At the end of the day, it's about understanding movement and how that migrates stress. It's about understanding the dose to create optimal adaptation, etc. Elite athletes know this. They put it into practice every day. Scientists must see movement. Well, surprisingly enough, if they don't measure it with their instrumentation, they might not always see it. That will surprise a lot of people. But when I first met Brian, one thing came across loud and clear. And that was, not only is he an exceptional athlete, but he is rare in that he sees movement. When we watch a combat event, say a UFC contest or a baseball game or some other sport, Brian's eye for seeing movement is very, very developed and really quite rare. The other thing is he's extremely disciplined and focused, and yet still an elite athlete. So that has been the beginning of our professional relationship. And then I think we sort of found out that we kind of like each other, and he's a wonderful person to spend time with. And then when we started to tell his story in the book, he could write. And that was the final surprise of all. So it's been a fabulous relationship for what I think we've been able to produce, but also a fabulous personal journey. I don't know if he would say the same thing. But anyway, that's how I would start that story.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a fabulous relationship. And it's been a very interesting time for me because when we go back to the book, the start of the book happened over 10 years ago, May of 2013. We're looking at August of 2013 now. And so it's been over 10 years. So the path has been a lot. It's been a lot of learning for me, you know. So me starting off as the athlete, there are a lot of things that I knew instinctively. I didn't know why they worked. I just knew that they worked. I knew that you needed deloads. I knew that you needed to back off. I knew that training when you're sore or unrecovered just wasn't a good idea. I knew this in high school instinctively when my football coach wanted me to bench press 4 times a week. It just didn't make sense to me. So when I got with Stu 10 years ago, I was raw in a lot of different ways. I knew why things worked, but I didn't have a full of understanding as to why. And then I could really start progressing my training because I was always a cerebral lifter. I just needed a little bit more of the science to understand the whys with it. And so when I met Stu, I started to understand the whys. And of course, moving better and building capacity and all those different rules that we know now as you read Gift of Injury, the errors that I was making day to day, not using my athleticism wisely, not taking appropriate time between my squat and my deadlift sessions. The way I moved with my spine hygiene was bad. I didn't, even though I was a good athlete and hit multiple world records prior to meeting Stu, I was still very undisciplined in areas that you're not going to learn from a Louis Simmons or from a article on T Nation. Basically, what I came up on: Louis Simmons, Elite FTS, T Nation, you name those, even Paula Quinn, those different things. Never did I come across any information like, hey, your back is your body, but in particular your back, very limited resource. Not only can you destroy that, but there's ways that you can mitigate the damage that you're going to inevitably create if you lift super heavy compressive loads for enough time. Give it enough time, eventually, in most cases, you're going to have something that wants to break on you or to go. So meeting Stu and understanding the science of everything really just made my appetite for learning more about it grow and actually supersede my interest in strength training and powerlifting. Even though they're all woven into the same thing now, I'm more interested in injury mechanisms than someone squatting big. But luckily for me, I can fuse them both together.
That's fantastic. That's exactly why we're here today. That's amazing. Actually, that really parallels my experience as well, coming from a completely different side. So I came in through martial arts. I've been doing that my entire life since I was 10 years old, so 33 years now, and quite intensely. So for me, when I read low back disorders for the first time, so many things clicked for me. It was like putting in the last piece of the puzzle, and I realized all of a sudden why I've been doing the things I've been doing my entire life. Now, fortunate for me, I had really great teachers. So they taught me about ball and socket motion, being free in those joints and being stiff in the trunk and the breathing patterns, the concept of how to weight transfer between hips and limbs and all of these things. that's really a requirement for traditional karate. And so I was very, very fortunate to have been brought up in a traditional environment. But still, coming from that into kickboxing, into MMA, some of the silly things we did, such as thousands of sit-ups, such as putting a bar on our back and with less than a perfect form, rotating back and forth aggressively. So as you can imagine, when I started to read the studies and I started to see what is actually happening on the inside, I froze and took a step back and reassessed, is this what I should be teaching others going forward, or should things be changing now with this new information? And so I'm forever grateful to the scientific endeavor that Professor Stuart McGill has traversed for our benefit in all areas of sport.
And I didn't really speak to, of course, I've enjoyed the relationship over the last 10 years. I love Stu like a father figure or like a brother, and we are just best of friends. So I wanted to clarify that. And the amount of information that I've learned in the last 10 years and 3 months is more than like 5 lifetimes of information. And every time I dive back in, or I got to spend a weekend with Stu where we assessed patients back in April. And we saw 3 different types of patients. We saw an older woman that's a marathon runner. We saw a stud baseball and football player that's back injured. Then we saw something middle of the road, a police officer around 38 years old. So I got to assess and watch with him and play jazz with him, workshop with him. And the amount that I learned, even though I've spent 10 years with him just in that weekend, is a lifetime again. So then I was able to level up even more with my information, my admiration, and appreciation for this guy.
Absolutely. I remember standing beside Professor Stu in Novi Sad when we were at schooling, and he turns to me and he says, "Aren't you doing this for like the 4th or 5th time?" And I said, "Every single time there's something that I catch, every single time," and that's true to this day. It's like as you grow, it's obvious that you're going to go back to the same book and see new things every time. And I've never ceased to learn from the work. Um, Let me just rack your guys' brain about one thing. There's a bit, or actually quite a lot, of unnecessary scuttlebutt on the internet regarding various applications of strength training, whether that be on the powerlifting front, whether that be on the CrossFit front, whether that be on the functional training front. And I feel like a lot of the discussions that we're having are really unproductive and really not going anywhere and seem to be more for clickbait and getting attention and getting reaction than actual productivity and actually helping people. So I just wanted to maybe, with your guys' help, put a couple of things to sleep or to rest. Um, when we talk about bilateral training being highly compressive and causing a very high price for the spine to bear, and we talk about bilateral training, I'm not such a fan of saying one is better than the other, but they're obviously very important components of the training process. For example, should I require lateral motion, I still need to be able to squat to create that force off of the ground. Even though one doesn't look like the other, there's still that transference. And a lot of people, start talking about contralateral movement as some sort of superior movement to bilateral training, that it's more natural and so on. And I kind of feel like this is a bit of philosophy. So instead of saying which is better, maybe we could have a quick discussion about what is the place of each and when and how would you program each type of movement. When would you do, for example, bilateral movements, and when would you use contralateral movements as you, let's say, plan for your sport?
You want to go first, Stu?
Well, I can do. We always start with an assessment, as you know, Paul, to define the goals. Part of our assessment is to define the athletic goals of the sport or whatever the activity happens to be. It might be an occupational endeavor. And then we assess the individual and their ability to meet the goals. If they are unable or deficit in one particular aspect, in other words, if they need something and they don't test very well for it, now we find the very best exercise, which is simply a tool to give them what they need that they don't have. And it's as simple as that. So sometimes a unilateral, as you call it, tool will be the most appropriate. Sometimes it's a bilateral tool. What does that person need and what are they deficit in? It doesn't get any more complicated than that. And you know me well enough. I don't love or hate anything. I just try and find the best tool for the goal.
Stole my answer, but unfortunately I got the answer from the man, so I can't blame him for that. But that's what it comes down to in my opinion as well. What are the goals of the athletes? What are the requirements of the sport? And then further than that, what's the position they play? In football, are they a quarterback, or are they a defensive end, or are they a linebacker, a free safety, or wide receiver? I was working with a lacrosse player the other day, and he's a face-off guy. Well, he doesn't need to squat deep because his hips are never even close to 90 degrees. So what do I do with him? I'll do some bilateral squats with him, but they'll be fast, explosive squats, cutting them to about a quarter squat or a third of a squat and exploding. Then we might do a couple vertical jumps after that to keep him quick and explosive. That is the exact replica of what he's going to be looking at on the field, because if you know lacrosse at all, the face-off guys, whenever the ball's dropped, they fight over it and then they sprint off the field. They're done. They're done in 10 seconds, 15 seconds. They're fast, explosive, strong, and then they're out of there. So we'll use unilateral with him too, some split squats and such, but then you have to turn the page a little bit and ask the biological limitations of the athlete, the injury history, the age of the athlete, juice worth the squeeze. It might not be worth putting a bar on someone's back if they're an older athlete, haven't dealt with back or hip issues. It's just going to depend on the sport and then the position of that sport and then the athlete's limitations and strengths and weaknesses, of course.
That makes a lot of sense. Personally, I kind of feel like when people are critiquing heavy bilateral work, what they're actually critiquing is maybe a person who may not understand any time to recover in between sessions. Maybe they're just overloading themselves. And then obviously then people start having opinions about compressive loads and unnatural movement and so on. But really, it could be just a case of poor loading or just poor planning.
Poor programming, the frequency, intensity, the volume, all those different things could play a factor. And then, of course, the form, the amount of core stiffness. While, if someone's sloppy like a slinky when they're squatting, even the untrained eye can see that's not correct. That's when you have the average public jumping in and putting their nose in something they know enough to be dangerous, that someone should not be moving under load like that, like a slinky, like we see some NFLers or even some CrossFit athletes and such. They're all loose, and the average person can see that's not going to be a good thing. But I agree, the arguing, bickering over someone saying you have to do bilateral or you never should do bilateral, that's where the problem is. And it's just clickbait, and it doesn't do anyone any good. It should be a discussion, and it really just depends on what the athlete needs.
That's exactly why I'm grateful to have a really nuanced discussion with you gentlemen today. I guess the next place I wanted to go with this was the summoning of neural drive and the different techniques or visualizations that you would use while you're training. The mind is very, very powerful. Maybe you could give some examples of ways that you could excite or prepare the mind and the body for performance. And also, further to this, maybe how to detune yourself after your performance is done. Personally, I remember nights where you just lay there after a fight and you can't close your eyes because you're so wired, and yet nobody ever talked to us about detuning or what to do with a highly tuned athlete when they're finished competing. So maybe if you could share some of your thoughts on this process.
Well, summoning neural drive and the visualizations and then the detuning, you have very good questions. So I would go to a very dark place, and I would maybe start with a bark or a yell, or I might even just randomly get pissed off at someone in the gym. It's not healthy. I'm not saying all this stuff is healthy, so let me preface this. But someone might do something that's a little irritating to me in the gym, and I just thrive off of it. I just turn on and get really dark and really pissed off, and I harness every bit of that, and I'm MFing and I'm getting under the bar, and I'm just locked in, and nothing matters more than me at that time than smashing this weight. And that's where I would go. It might be a yell, it might be a bark, it might be a stomp, it might be a psoas stretch and a lunge, different things, but I could go there mentally pretty easily. But it's a double-edged sword, because then you start tapping into that when you're not in the gym. And then you go really dark when you're dealing with someone at the grocery store that does something wrong to you. So that's hard to turn it off for me. So it's a blessing and a curse to be able to go so dense with that and not care about anything else. But it can also carry over in other parts of your life when you're just trying to get a point across to someone and they're not getting it. Then you like go to the next level because you're like, what are you not getting? And then it could be a little bit dark in your life. So it's been something I've been able to turn off pretty well since I retired 3 years ago after the 1,300-pound squat. But detuning afterward, whether you're up on stimulants or just the adrenaline or just being so wired and turned on, man, that's, some people use substances. I use CBD. I have my own CBD line, but back, in the middle of my career, I didn't have anything like that. I didn't use cannabis or anything. I used melatonin or something, but relaxing, taking a hot bath and a cold shower, maybe some contrast, going for a swim, going for a walk, saying some prayers for me, maybe reading the Bible can help me detune. But that's a very loaded question too, because each person's going to respond to ways to get up and go to the dark place. And then each people are going to respond differently on winding down and coming down. So for some, that might just be reading a book at night and just calming down, meditating. But it took me my whole career to start really figuring out how to get up and control it, and then how to hone it in and wind it down afterward, instead of just being on all the time and being a raging a-hole in some cases, to be honest with you.
That's a great answer. For me, that's heat, cold, mantra work, breath, and sound vibration. That tunes me right down. That's something I need to do at the end of the day if I've had a really long or intense day, or a day where I haven't stopped my mind all day long. Professor, do you want to speak to this topic? I know that you're one of the first people I heard speak about detuning at all.
Well, if I could just take one step back to the fundamental concept of strength, Paul. Strength is a skill, and it all starts with a thought. What Brian was talking about was creating a mindset to create the densest thought, because that's what gets converted to nerve impulses and eventually strength. I'm going to tell you a story of a Polish weightlifter, already had 1 or 2 world records, and he was competing in the Olympic clean and jerk. So he had the load to set the next world record. He'd done the clean. He was there ready for the final jerk, but he knew he had the next record, and he had an internal smile. He became slightly happy and satisfied, and he lost the density of the thought, that very dark place that Brian is describing, where you need to densify, and he lost the lift in the next world record. So there's an example of, it starts with a thought, and different athletes use different techniques. It's usually one of darkness. Bill Kazmaier, world's strongest man for the first 3 or 4 years, he uses a position of light, and he says he feels the power of the Lord invading his body, and he gets goose pimply and beads of sweat come on. But again, he's magnificent in this mind control. Then the trick is to translate that thought into nerve impulses, and then get the hardware, which are the nerves, to transmit that density of current. And if it was a pure wire conducting electricity, we'd have a discussion about current density. Well, athletes create the ability to have very high current density through exercise. They train doing grinding exercises, grinding out a bench press, pushing the bar up the ramp, bending the bar, pulling the bar apart, pulling it together. All of these manipulations of the mind to get more density of current or more pulses carrying through the nerve. So that's conditioning the hardware. The other side of it is you can create the highest neural drive and density through speed. And I know there's a bit of a discussion about, well, the Olympic lifters are the power speed lifters, and the power lifters are a bit of the slow grinders of the sport. That's not been my experience, not at all. When you take someone like Brian, and I kid you not, we were sitting on his porch and a housefly flew by in midair, and Brian snatched the fly out of the air. I've never seen anyone do that before. This is the man who just set the world squat record. The point being, his speed is off the chart. I think of Andy Bolton, the first guy to pull 1,000, the great British power lifter. Man, Andy could sprint. Bill Kazmaier could sprint. So again, the point is, it takes a different type of neurological training to be that quick and then get neural density that way. So I just thought I would mention a bit more of the science of the art and skill of creating great strength. And then, of course, we live in a linkage, the skeleton, and the key there is to be very strategic in stiffening the weaker joints to allow the most powerful ball and socket joints like the hips to then move and unleash, create the power, but that power has to be transmitted through stiffer segments like a flexible rod, which is your spine. If you have 1,000 pounds on your back or 450 kilos and your spine has a little bit of laxity in it, that load will crush you. So these are the final bits of skill to create the most appropriate blend of stability and mobility through the linkage to create that strength and unleash it into a movement. This just popped into my head, but I know Brian and I have discussed this. You know, I used to ask my students, oh, does everyone know how to bench press? And of course, everyone in my class would say, oh, sure we do. And then we would have a 1-hour workshop on it. And by the end of that, they realized they hadn't a clue how to push the maximum amount of weight on a bar in a bench press style. But if I was then to go to Brian and say, now here's the man who has the highest squat in human history. Could you do that again? And how many of those perfect lifts have you performed in your career? And when you listen to this answer, it's such an education for the young folks who think they know how to squat. So I'm taking your role here a tiny bit, Paul, but how many perfect squats have you had, Brian?
Maybe one, and then that's why I quit, because I finally got it right. But you know, I was always chasing perfection in the perfect lift. And that was a really easy way for me to walk away and say, hey, I lifted that one perfectly. I'm not going to be able to repeat that. Most likely it's time to get away. I'm in one piece. I actually made a promise to God as I was walking up, and during the dark and rage, I'm praying too. And I told him, get me through this last lift in one piece and I'm done. Just get me through this last one, because the dark place is also fear. When you're fighting, Pavel, you should be scared of that other person because they could end you. So you need to have a healthy fear. That healthy fear will push you, as Rocky says, you know, you can't let it consume you, but you got to let it push you and motivate you. So I would be scared to death of embarrassing myself. I didn't want to embarrass myself. You know, I had my wife and my 2 babies. They were 6 months old in the crowd that time for the last lift. I didn't want to be carried off a stretcher screaming. You know, so I was scared to death of what might happen, because what is the ultimate human load where the most weak linkages of the body cannot handle the squat? Is it the feet, the toes, the ankles, the knees? I don't know what it is, but there's a limit to where someone picks up 1,600 pounds and things are going to start snapping right away. So I was afraid that I might be getting ready to cross that tipping point of ultimate human limits, because we know the limit isn't 1,300 pounds, but it's most likely not 2,600, right? It's not double that. Where is that limit? It's somewhere in there, but I just knew I was starting to approach it. So that fear helped me keep myself on my toes as well.
That's great. You've actually answered another question I have here. So let me just come right back around to that one. Just wanted to interject a couple of thoughts though before I do. When we're talking about powerlifters moving slowly, I think that most people get that idea because they're looking at the actual performance of lifting a silly amount of weight for a normal human. I mean, you guys it takes a long time to get to where you are performing. And when you lift, you're moving slowly, but it is still the speed of the muscle contraction that had to overcome that mass. So people, I think, underestimate that speed strength aspect of powerlifting, unless they've been in that environment. So
Yep.
Go
that's one
watch
thing.
the lift. It's on YouTube. It's not a slow lift. The world record squat is incredibly, impressively fast. But then we get into the discussion there of when muscles create supreme force, they also create supreme stiffness and slow down. So that management, that fight between strength and stiffness uh, plays out. And I think that was another fascinating feature of that lift, Brian. It was incredibly fast.
It felt manageable.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you get stuck and stopped and the stiffness sets in, the lift is over.
Gravity was going to say hello.
Like everything, it must be a U-shaped curve. So I suppose you have to experience the lift fully. You can't be ahead of yourself trying to get to the end of it, or else you just crush yourself. You fall apart technically. But you also have to be with it, or else you burn out if you spend too much time underneath that weight, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're speaking about being under the weight. The most I'd ever had on my back, my prep went well going into it. For the most part, I did tear my bicep off a month before the competition, and so I had surgery right after the squat. But that's a different topic. The topic that I'm focusing on now is the most I'd ever squatted in the gym was 12:15. The most I'd ever had on my back was 12:15. And at the meet, I was able to have a hypercompensation of about 100 pounds. And that's because my peaking and loading and intensity was tapered and waved in such a way that I was ready to handle the most adversity on meet day and the most load and intensity. So I think that's something that people could learn from too. You don't have to handle the weight in the gym to be able to reproduce that. Just like a lot of strategic marathon runners will end up running 19 or 20 miles before they're 26. They peak for it. They build for it. They train for executing it in competition, not training it, doing it, and then hoping to replicate it. Meanwhile, you just smoke yourself mentally and physically during training. That's one big mistake younger lifters make. They think they have to be able to feel it to lift it, and that's not the case.
No, it's not. That I've heard from Edward Cohen. I've heard that from Professor Stewart many times regarding the great legendary lifters. I believe Alexiev. There's a great story about that. That he didn't want to hear the amount of weight going on the bar, etc. That it's just a stimulus, right? The weight is actually a way to engage your nervous system and your biomechanics.
And if you can really believe that you can do something and fool yourself into thinking you can do it in a way, you can surprise yourself if you don't get too caught up in the details.
It's actually where, that kind of brings us or bridges this conversation into the topic of the mind, because let me back up actually for a second. So this past weekend, we shot a little bit of material regarding hypnotherapy. And the gentleman that came here to do it from Italy, his name is Giancarlo Russo. He is actually one of the Italian delegates to Carroll. So the great Carroll was his mentor and teacher. And he's also been involved with hypnotherapy for over a couple of decades, I'm sure, maybe more. He's really, really great. Some of it is neurology, using movement, using touch, using sound. So there's nothing, there's no black magic there. It's literally facilitating person's wishes by putting them into a hypnotic state in order to make some change, to facilitate some change. And he was showing us some of the techniques on a beautiful lady who was sitting there, and he had brought her mind back to a time when she remembered making snowballs and making a snowman in front of her grandmother's house. And then he led her into a meditation where she imagined placing her fingers into ice. Well, he pulled out a lighter. He put it right underneath her fingers, and she didn't budge. And as soon as he was done, he had me put my hands on both of her palms. One was ice cold and one was room temperature. So that's just speaking to the mind and what can happen when the mind is really, really present with an idea, and how it can basically blow up that idea to affect the physiology. That's obviously something that you guys do when you get under the bar. But also the mind can go the other way, and it can trick us, and it can also make us fail, and it can also make us think the wrong things. So for example, borrowing from my own experience, whenever I was in the ring and I started thinking, this guy's really good, guess what always happened? I got hit, right? And if I was thinking, I'm doing really well, guess what happened? Right? Because my mind wasn't where it was supposed to be.
Right.
And so I wanted to speak to that a little bit. The dark place in the mind of an injured body. I would love it if we could speak about fear and doubt, because those are places that we all go, whether it be in the athletic world, whether it be in life. And all humans end up in that place sometimes. And one of the things that fascinates me about champions is their ability to use that place to overcome themselves and then come out the other end a legend. And that's exactly what you had achieved. And so maybe each of you could speak a little bit to that place in the mind, which was at one point fearful or questioned the outcome, but that made you wiser, more directed, or better in any way.
Would you like me to start? Or would you like Stu to go? Me to start? Okay. I had failed so many times. So I was in a pretty dark place when I met Stu in 2013 of May of 2013. So I had a lot of doubts because I had, watched my athleticism kind of continue to bleed out. I've been able to do less and less weight, less and less things outside of the gym, pain-free. And I saw the writing on the wall, and it wasn't good. And I went to the doctors and everything, so that did not help. But when I reached out to Stu and I went up to see him May 1st of 2013, I'll never forget any of this stuff. I went in there as a complete beginner. That's the key. That's what I try to get across to people. And some people think that I'm preaching at them or whatever, but they have to understand that you have to drop the ego. Drop the ego. And I went in there as a new beginner. I don't care if I had world record at 275, a world record at 220, was top 2 every year, even when I was hurt. What I was doing was not working. So what I did is I went in there and said, I am going to give everything I have to this protocol. Stu and I went through the process. We did the assessment. We spent the whole day together, actually. And we made a good relationship starting off. And Stu will always tell you the truth. And that's his job. Our job is when we have a prognosis for someone, we got to tell them the truth. It isn't, Pavel, we really like you, so we're going to kind of make you feel better about the whole thing. We're going to do it in good faith and do it honestly and do it with empathy, but we got to be truthful. So Stu was truthful to me and said, you're done. I think that you need to retire. If you were my son, I'd urge you to retire. I don't think you have anything left. I do think I can get you out of pain. But getting back under the bar would be very unwise, especially if you still have the neurological symptoms. And so I said, fine, I'm going to listen to everything you tell me, dropping the ego. But when I get pain-free, I'm going to rebuild, and I want to attempt to get back under the bar. I want to get my world record squat back that had gotten broken that year actually had gotten broken at 275. Dave Hoff broke it with 12:10 at 275. And so I wanted that back. I ended up getting it back, breaking his 1273 with 1306. But I understand, I have empathy with people that have been through this process. But even though I had the best guy in my corner, even though I'd fully committed to the process, I still had doubts because I was like, man, I'm not having much pain. The pain was wound down very quickly because of the program and the adherence. I never strayed off the program any, but I still had fear and doubt because there was no guarantees. Plus, I had the best back guy in the world that was very honest with me. I don't think this is wise. Not even sure if it's even possible. But I use that as motivation to get better each day. And I just fueled the doubt with program adherence and staying on track. And there were times when I started lifting again, quite a few months down the road. The first time I lifted the 315, I remember it was heavy. And these were weights that I was lifting in high school. And here I am, 30 years old, world record holder, former world record holder. And I'm struggling with 315. But the only silver lining was I didn't have pain. So you got to pick your wins and track them as you're going through the process. And you got to be patient. You got to buy into the process and you got to adhere to the protocol. That's the only way I made it. Lots of prayer. But you want to hear something? This is going to turn things on its head a little bit. It was harder than actually rehabbing with Stu and failing and then coming back and getting on track for 5 or 6 years. What was the hardest thing about all of that? In some ways, it was writing the book. The process of doing it was easier than writing the book because I put so much effort into writing the book. Writing the book was probably the hardest thing I've ever done. Rehabbing is probably top 3.
Can I just have a quick question before we let the prof speak? Reading your book, I was thinking to myself, it's one thing to attempt a world-class power lift. I mean, that you have to be thinking to yourself, I'm doing this right or I'm going to the hospital. But in your case, especially after your injury, having looked at this injury and having looked at what you had to do to get back, I mean, it must have been, maybe you didn't even have this thought, but it must have been a thought like, I could be done here under this bar right now. I asked that question because just 2 weeks ago we had a tragedy in Indonesia, and I'm sure everyone's talking about this in your realm. I don't know how you felt about that lift, but every mistake was made, and obviously that person was not respecting that bar or that weight in the same way as you would making a world-class lift, right? But what was going on through your head when you're facing something that severe or that severe of a consequence for not being impeccable?
Lots of prayer, lots of focus, and that's actually the thing that's most exhausting physically. I'm fine. I could keep competing for a good bit of time. I believe that. I'm a little delusional and I get that, but I think that I could compete for a number of years, even at 42, and be very successful, even PR. It's the minutia and the attention to every single detail that utterly exhausts me. The right warm-up, the right choice, the right approach, going dark, detuning at night, doing it all over again every day. That is absolutely exhausting. And that's the only way you can do that and go to sleep at night and wake up and get under the bar without stepping away from the bar in too much fear. You got to prepare for every detail. You got to believe no matter what and listen to your body. If you're setting up for the squat and something truly feels off and you're not at a competition, shut it down, back off, reevaluate. So just being very cerebral about the approach, but not being so cerebral that you paralyze yourself and overthink things. That aspect of towing that line is exhausting.
Professor, what can you tell us?
Well, obviously, I'm going to address the issue from a slightly different perspective. I was on a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and the host said, you're known as a spine biomechanist, but he'd also had come to know some of the athletes I'd worked with, and he says that you practice biomechanics, but what do you think of the psychosocial approach? Because I've heard some people have gone to see you and they say it's a biopsychosocial approach. What I think Brian was describing there was simply that as he was going through the process of scientific mechanostimulation. So you're stimulating the cells to grow and strengthen by challenging them, giving them the right nutrition, and giving them the right amount of rest. The story for building bone, which Brian had to do, it's a very different regimen than building muscle or collagenous tissues, for example. So he described, well, 315 was heavy, but there were times when he would just put a heavy load on his back and just feel it, and that was it. And slowly build back the physicality to support these loads. But along with that, I think you've been hearing, came the mental confidence to know what that load feels like and know that he can handle it. He was also working on strategies to, if you're under several hundred pounds, and what we call the thrust line, which is the line from the center of mass of the bar down through the various joints of your body, the distance between that line and every joint creates stress. So you're trying to direct the thrust line through. Well, you can imagine if you're under 1,000 or 1,300 pounds and that thrust line moves a millimeter, it's a very difficult thing to correct. If you try and correct it with your spine, you will lose the lift. Bending your spine a little bit loses the stiffness that is needed for the spine to bear the load. So you have to develop hip strategies, ankle strategies, pushing the toes, all of these things. And that gives great confidence. Now I'm going to go back to that biopsychosocial question. When you train that way and organize the mechanostimulation, which is physiology and biomechanics and neurology, are you not giving the person cognitive behavioral therapy at the same time? Building their confidence, giving them postures of confidence, moving away from the depression of the injury. Clinical depression is to slouch around. That's, if you look at a clinical psychology textbook, we are trying to move athletes away from the postures associated with clinical depression. We're trying to build confident warriors. So now I ask the question, is it cognitive behavioral therapy that we do? Is it neurology, biomechanics, physiology, psychology, sociology? And I hope you're starting to see that all these lines are now blurred. We're creating a system of optimal function, and it's all of the above. Anyway, that's how I would answer that.
I really, really appreciate that answer, actually, because this is very close to my heart. On a daily basis, I tell people it's not one or the other, it's both. That they're integrated, and you cannot separate the body and the mind. Even if you look at Asian cultures, kokoro, heart, mind, you cannot separate physicality from the mind because we reside within the body. And so you can approach it from the psychosocial side, and you can have some good success with some people. But like with most things, you have to match the genesis of pain with the right methodology. And if you have biomechanics on one side and you have the mind on the other, that's a great synergy. Why would we separate? Why would we bicker? It's akin to that conversation about bilateral versus contralateral training. You need both. And to your point, training people, we've all had that experience, empowers them and changes their mind. Our clientele is more of the executive seated population. So I like to think of our clients as endurance sitters. And we train them appropriately. We see where they are, we see where they need to be, as you say, and we train the difference. So for me, that's much more rewarding, because if I get a super athlete like Brian, what am I supposed to do? He's already a finely tuned machine. I might be able to tweak something, but if somebody shows up, they've got back pain and they're super deconditioned, I'm going to have them feeling like a hero in 3 months' time, just because I know what to do with them, but I'll also explain to them what not to do, which is just as much, if not more important at times. That's fantastic. So we've got dense neural drive, we've got kinetic linkage, which is a requirement in order to be able to unleash that dense neural drive, and now we've got mindset. And I guess the next step for me in the process of training humans would be patience, adherence, and protocol. So we appreciate results, but rarely understand the path traversed. And so maybe, Brian, if you could just speak about some of the difficulties you've experienced and during the process of recovery and comeback, and what did that teach you, and how did that change you as a human being or as a person? One of the things that I would love is if you managed to share with us ways that you managed to stay consistent, because one of the things that I've noticed with humans is that consistency is the most difficult thing for them. People come in excited, motivated. A lot of the time, they get a trainer or a therapist as a way to outsource motivation. But as we always say, the best training program is the one that you can stay consistent with. So if either of you or both of you have some tips to stay consistent, that would be great.
Well, I believe the way my brain works is a little bit of an outlier. I'm a glutton for punishment, and I learn the best when those grooves are carved into my brain that are painful. So I learned the best through that. So I just knew there was no other way to go about this. I knew I had the right ticket, and I was on the train, and I was not coming off until it derailed, I guess, and whatever that was going to mean. But regardless, I was going to go down with it. So I didn't give myself a choice to be consistent or not. When you really want something, you just do it. You don't tell people about what you're doing. You go and you do it. People don't have to see you do it, but you do it. I was bought in, and I had no choice. My back was ruined, so I had to buy into the process. I had back pain day to day, just sitting and standing. So I needed to get pain free, number one, and my ways didn't work. So I just basically brainwashed myself into knowing this is the only way. I didn't read stuff on the internet and YouTube and start thinking, oh man, I'm not using my back as much. It's not gonna heal now. That's one thing that I see that really interrupts people's flow of recovery is when you put them on a good program, you did an assessment with them, and then they start reading this article and that article about what someone did for their facet joint or their disc bulge or their vertebral fracture. The next thing you know, they're not buying into the program anymore. They're being slack with their program. Then what makes it even worse is when they start adding in things you did not give them. And then they're off in the ditch. I never added in one thing that Stu didn't give me. I followed the plan to the T, zero exceptions. And I think that's not going to be the typical person that's going to be that locked in. But that's the way I did it. I think that Stu and I have talked about this at length. He certainly doesn't see people with fresh back pain. I don't much either, but especially Stu. So I learned that nothing else worked. I tried everything, the shots, the stretching, the mobility work, the resting, the weighted sit-ups, the reverse hyper. I tried all those things and I didn't get better, or they made me worse. So I was completely bought in. Patience is the key to success in every way. So some people have to learn it the hard way. I became more patient, though, significantly after the process. After the process of coming back over those 18 months, I failed after the first year at the Arnold, which you can read about in Gift of Injury. I made it all the way back to almost a year post seeing Dr. McGill, and then my back flared up on me at the Arnold. I still needed another 6 months. I still had more patience that needed to be enacted. I still needed to be a little bit more patient. And that patience, that little bit more time, brought awareness to the fact that I was still creating a little bit too much compression day to day, being too heavy. I dropped 30 pounds. That made me turn the corner. Patience allowed that for that to happen. And consistency and patience. Some people aren't going to get better because they lack those.
100% agreed. Actually, just to interject really quickly, I see a lot of people come in, and I think most of the time, if whatever we've given them is not working, or if they feel like they're having episodes during, they're doing something else on top. And a lot of the time it's just because the nature of our clientele. I mean, the demographic is your, A types, your CEO, top manager, very busy person, traveling a lot, high responsibility, high expectations of themselves. And inevitably, what ends up happening is they'll come in, they'll do a consult, they'll do 10 times more homework than we want them to, and then they're still pulling their knees to their chest. And it takes a bit of time before they're willing to let go of all of the other things because they figure more is better.
Yep.
Professor, could you maybe speak to the physiology of what we're talking about here?
Not really. I think Brian's covered it.
Okay,
The point is well made.
fantastic.
And unless you had a more specific question, maybe I'm missing that.
No, I personally, when I talk to people about consistency, I try to sort of reverse engineer the typical case scenario, because people will come in and they want to be motivated in order to do the work. And I kind of feel like that's kind of in reverse, because if you get into a habit of doing a little bit every day, that will accumulate. That's one of the things I learned from you. Having come from a background of too much too often, you really taught me about accumulating work. And when that happens, you get results real quick, relatively quick. When people ask me, in fact, when do I get my results? I'll tell them, well, when was Christmas? Oh, it feels like 5 minutes ago. Well, why are you even asking? It's going to be here in a second.
Right.
It's just about consistency, right? Just small, consistent regularity and small steps that accumulate to a lot of effect. If you think about working on your back as often as you brush your teeth, that's going to accumulate to a tremendous amount of work at the end of the year. But on a daily basis, it doesn't seem like that much. So I'm really, really a big fan of minimalism, regular minimalism, I like to call it. If that's
Least
something I
effective
think that
dose. I love the least effective dose is what I like to tell people, even out of the back pain realm. The least effective dose that's helping you get progress, then add 5 or 10% at a time, build it up a little bit. So that might be for one of our, clients that fit the program for 3 10-minute walks. Start there, least effective. You're getting better. You can walk for 10 minutes, start there, then build it up a little bit at a time, but don't go from least effective dose to as much as possible. Tune it up 5-10%, go another minute or two, see how that does for a little bit. I'm interested how Stu gets buy-in from clients when people are not motivated to exercise. I'm curious about that. Their back pain, they come to you and they need to be walking, they need to be doing exercise, and they're bored after a month and they're complaining about it and they're not motivated anymore.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Well, of course, everyone is different. I've explained the science of how to stimulate those tissues to do whatever we've defined needs to be done. How to condition their mind, their psychology, etc. And you started out this podcast by saying we tell the truth. So I tell them the truth. And then I say, it's up to you. And I do a lot of play acting. I know some people consider this harsh, but I'll say to them, I can't help you if you won't do the work. So, I'll even look at them and say, do you enjoy your pain? Because that's your behavior is resulting in that. So you can change your behavior and change the course of this mechanism if it's possible. So I just I have a feeling as well, though, to be very forthright about this. The people that we attract are people who are committed. You know where I live. I live in the middle of Ontario. It's not an easy place to get to. They have to work to get to our clinic here. So, if someone says, oh, do you have a clinician who's 30 minutes from my house? And if I say no, and then they say, well, you're a 5-hour flight away and whatnot. And I haven't told them that my previous client just flew in from Germany or Australia or wherever it happened to be. So they have no concept of the the commitment and what's required to change the course of the thing that is ruining their life. So I point that out to them, and those who aren't warriors or solidly committed to getting their back better go by the wayside. And there's not much I can do about that.
I'm glad
I could give them $1,000. I will give $1,000 to one person and they go invest it, and the next year they have 2,000. I give it to someone else and it was all spent on candy. You know, it's just
that's, I mean, it's not my interview to do, but I think that's kind of what Pavel was looking at. Just some kind of like, how do you handle those type of people? Because it is difficult, because even like the strong warriors, I'll get an email from the strong warriors every once in a while, and they're weary, they're beat down, they're downtrodden, you know, they're missing their workouts. Well, one thing is, get the hell off social media and stop comparing yourself to other people. Stop worrying about what the other person is doing in their back recovery path. Focus on you, take it one day at a time. But the psychology is a big part on how you approach that person, dependent on where they are mentally and their personality, and then everything in between that.
Well, one thing that I do try and do, now you're twigging my brain a little bit, Brian, is I try and give them a movement hack so they can do something pain-free almost immediately. So it shows them, wow, he just changed the course of my pain. And it might be as simple as giving them something, a rolled up hoodie behind their low back when they sit in a chair. Oh yeah, that took my pain away. That took the buzz out of my foot. Or something very quick to demonstrate to them that they have the power to change the course of this. Now let's start putting it together in a justifiable way. So I might use that sometimes as well. Sometimes, you know, when I'm, you know, I have a tremendous emotional investment with some people. They're very mentally distraught, and I'm on the verge of tears myself. Sometimes they just need a hug and showing that someone cares. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not here to take your money. I'm here. You've asked me to change your life. So I'm in that with you. I'm told that is not their usual experience. So maybe that helps some people. Other people I'm pretty rough with, and just say, well, you know, what do you expect with your behavior?
One more thing, and I'll let you have your podcast back. I'm sorry, Pavel. He was rough with me. Stu was rough with me. But it got my attention. It only took him 5 times to say, stop, Brian, what are you not understanding about your pain mechanism? You're a smart guy. What are you not understanding about the relation to your injury, flexion and compression under load, with the way you're grabbing that kettlebell? What are you not getting? And then finally, it clicked. Dude, I'm just being a knucklehead right now. I never made that mistake again. You can ask Stu now. 10 years later, I still move well. That day changed my life because he was rough with me. Someone else that was soft, that may have broke them. Of course, Stu's not going to get that rough with them, you know, just because I was making the same mistake over and over, but it got my buy-in. And that's the word that came to mind when Stu was talking. I might show them a hat, take away their buzz, take away their lumbar pain with just a little bit of support. You get the buy-in, then you get their attention, and then they're eager to learn.
That's fantastic. Oh, so many thoughts. You know, art and science. This is what Professor keeps talking about, right? We've got the science, and then we've got the art, which is dealing with the human. One of the most powerful things about the McGill assessment, the thorough assessment, is that there are multiple opportunities, live, real time, to show the person how they're getting into pain and how they're getting out of pain. And that process is what makes them click and realize that they actually own that process. It's their postures, motions, and loads that cause pain or give them a position of repose. So that's a really important process where you really connect with that person. and you show them that it's possible on the spot, and you make them responsible for doing the work. And that's a really, really powerful thing. I think that's the most powerful thing that I've learned from the prof to date. Um, my gym looks a bit like a temple, like a Japanese temple. So when people come in, they're sort of attracted to this. They look at the design, and I talk about this kintsugi art concept. I don't know if you've ever been, if you've ever seen this, but basically it's broken Japanese pottery, and it's fixed with gold cracks. And this is supposed to be a representation of imperfection becoming beautiful, and it's kind of a symbol for experience and wisdom. So this kind of reminded me of your wounds, kind of gristled over with wisdom. People talk about things like badge of honor, and I've heard you laugh at that because it's a silly thought, but there is something to having traversed your very heavy and difficult experience, some wisdom that you achieved that you're hoping to give to others, obviously, without the necessity of traversing that path, which is quite arduous. So maybe you can just tell me your thoughts on that. Maybe, Professor, if you wouldn't mind sharing us a little bit of your wisdom that you have picked up from your experience with your hips.
Do you want to go first, Brian?
I can, however you want to do, sir.
Well, maybe I'll just start quite simply, Paul, by saying I don't know of an elite athlete who isn't managing something. And the successful ones are the ones who've navigated their way around whatever the thing is that is a challenge for them. There's no uninjured elite athletes, at least in my experience. So one of the great joys of my life now is to take a real battle-worn athlete and maybe give them a little bit more of a career extension, and then a very successful wind down into civilian life. And quite often those injuries will come back, not while they're competing, but as they're winding down this elite tuned body into something that is more sustainable from a health point of view for the rest of their life. But anyway, that's just another challenge, and it's quite a different science, I might say. But those are all incredibly worn bodies with a lot of mileage and a lot of gold fill in the cracks.
I changed a lot during the time, a great deal. And the way you imagine, my injury gristled over, wounds of wisdom, definitely. So you've probably heard me talk about the people that brag about their injuries. And I think that if you can look at it and look at the injury in a way that you learned through this Japanese concept, awesome way to do it. But I think it's dangerous when you're bragging and having a dick measuring contest with people saying, well, yeah, well, I did both biceps and both pecs within 6 months. That ain't like, that's the bro talk that was like really obnoxious to me. I'm proud of the fact that I was able to come back from my injuries for a lot of different reasons, mostly because I can help other people, but also it was a big confidence booster with me, the relationships I've built and everything. But I'm so much of a better person. I'm so much more open to learning now. I've got a wealth of knowledge I would have never had if I didn't go down this path, meeting meeting Stu and going through this. You have youth on one end where you have all the unlimited athleticism. Then you have your wisdom, which comes with older age. They're never on the same. So when you can take a piece of broken pottery and fuse it back together and it works well, you have the elements of both wisdom and youth, and you can mesh them together in your 30s or 40s or whatever it ends up being. But for sure, I didn't have any of that wisdom necessary in my 20s. But I don't think a lot of people do. If you look at the fighters in the UFC during their 20s, how ridiculous they are. Then they mature and change and realize some of the things that they've done. if only they would have trained smarter or not partied so much is a big one for UFC fighters. I think that injury stopped me in my tracks and made me completely do a 180 in a lot of areas of my life. So it definitely, there's a lot of parallels to what you're bringing up with the Japanese art.
Fantastic. It's been the same also on my journey with knees and shoulder and wrist and knuckles. Things like fractures that take a year and a half to heal. Things like uh, hematoma in the knee that makes you sit down for a year and a half when you're about to start a pro kickboxing career. That obviously makes you sit back and reanalyze and rethink and reassess what you're doing wrong and what you're doing when you're not doing. So that's really important. Um, I'm cognizant of the time, gentlemen, so I'd maybe just leave room for one more question, and then we can do a few plugs before we bring this into an end today. It's been a great conversation so far. The last thing I wanted to talk about was this sort of concept of entertaining what is so-called impossible. A lot of clients, when they come in, a lot of the time they'll come in, they'll show me the report from the orthopedic report. They will click open an MRI in my reception. That's usually when I end up showing them page 41 or 42 from your book, because they're usually very distraught and very worried and feel that there's something very wrong with them. And there's a ton of great one-liners that I've learned from the prof. One of them being, "Youth is wasted on the young," and another one being, "You wouldn't go up to your mother-in-law and tell her she has degenerative face disease, would you?" And so while we're having this conversation and making light of the um, pain that they find themselves in, um, we end up talking about the fact that what they're dealing with is living tissue. Because oftentimes when they hear things like degeneration or they get their diagnosis, whatever that may be, discopathy. Oh my God, I have a discopathy. Well,
Oh,
you have a problem with your disc. It's a discopathy. Well, it's a problem with your disc. Let's talk about what makes it so. Um, so people start to realize this is living tissue. So it may not heal as fast as muscle, but it's still possible. And while science is still debating as to the mechanisms, I really like to show them this image because it's just so much further along in an injury cascade compared to what they have. And at that point, they usually light up and there's buy-in. And they start to feel a lot more confident, especially when that experience is paired and that conversation is paired with the McGill tests, which show them on the spot how they get into pain and how they get out of pain. So when we're talking about that recovery, I mean, if I were to show this book to a surgeon, they would say not possible. And I know that we're still at in a place in time where we're just starting to understand the exact physiological processes that can cause such a healing. But can we speak to that as we hone in here?
Do you want me to start?
for sure.
Yeah. So in the book, I showed, because I wrote this particular section, an MRI that Brian brought to me the very first time I met him. And then we had the MR redone. How many years after? Was that about 3 years after, Brian? Four years afterwards? So in the original MRI, we see a bone fracture, we see edema, and right into the bone of the vertebra. We see a disc bulge at 2 levels, etc. In the 4-year follow-up MRI, a lot of that has been addressed. So when a surgeon says, well, this is impossible, that's rather odd because there's several papers now that show most large disc bulges will resolve. So we spent a lot of years in our university lab. We would create disc bulges on cadavers and then figure out the protocols for vacuuming the disc bulge in, what movements, what loads, etc., and then try and incorporate those in a person's life. We try and reduce or increase the ability of nerves to migrate through the foramen and central canal with nerve flossing. The edema over time slowly resolves, and it is no longer, there's quite a lot of biochemistry in all of this. The first time the nucleus leaves the disc through a breach or an injury, it's seen as a foreign body that was fused up in the fetus the day of neurulation, which is about 1 month after conception. It's never seen the mother's immune system before, nor its own, because the nucleus of the disc is a very avascular structure. It doesn't receive blood. So the first time it crosses either the end plate vertically into the vertebral body, which we see in Brian's fracture, or the collagen fibers tear the Sharpie's fibers, which is where they're connected to the cartilage, and the nucleus seeps through there. That creates an incredible edema and inflammatory response. But what that does is it turns the gel of the nucleus to a crab meat consistency, and if you manage it right, it plugs the breach, so to speak. So, and the final piece of the puzzle with Brian and why we did the exercise regimen that we describe in the book, I called it bone callousing. And I learned a lot of that from the early Soviet literature, actually, that became available once the Iron Curtain came down. What was that, 1998, I think? The Gorbachev with Glasnost brought the end to it. And we were able to see the science for the first time, together with some of the American science. And bone remodeling is driven primarily by a piezoelectric response. In other words, do you want me to explain this? It'll take me about 3 minutes.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so let me just take my forearm here, and if I was to bend my forearm, and I'll use this because a lot of the early science was actually done on bird wings, where some would be immobilized, others would be bent, and the scientists would measure the bone density. If I bend this bone like this surface goes into tension, this surface goes into compression. If I took a quartz crystal, which is a piezoelectric material, and I rub the quartz together like this at night, you would see lightning flashing through the quartz. So an electrical charge is built up as you deform the crystal. A bone is a metallic crystal. It's made from magnesium, calcium, all of these charged metals. So there's ions floating in the blood of free calcium, free magnesium, which are the building blocks of bone. As you bend the bone, you build an electric charge which sucks in and attracts the free ions to build the bone. So that's the great wisdom of how a bone knows how to remodel to the chronic stress. It's very, very interesting, but here's the rub, and here's what we tried with Brian. If you train like a bodybuilder, say 3 days a week, you tear down the muscle on Monday, you rest it on Tuesday, and it rebuilds a little bit stronger, hopefully, if you've done it all right. And then Wednesday, you break it down again and repeat the process to hypertrophy muscle. If you do that to bone, you won't build hypertrophy and anabolic processes. You will accumulate trauma because the turnover to scaffold the bone is 4 or 5 days. In other words, if we bend a bone, create the charge, or stress the bone, it will suck in and attach chemically more bone building blocks. But they're very weak chemical bonds. It takes 4 or 5 days for the body to scaffold in those new ions so it sticks and forms what's known as a bony callus. So in a long bone, if you stress it, the bony callus forms and it actually densifies the bone. We do know with osteoporosis, for example, if you're osteoporotic, because you've had mineral loss of the vertebra and then it fractures, a bony callus forms, and now on the DEXA scan, it's actually more dense. So I was taking all of this science and trying to create a training program with Brian to stimulate bone growth and really fill in the fracture. And that's what he did. He would, of course, do the neural and muscular programming every day, doing the big three, but he would do little stressors to the bone every 4 or 5 days. For example, a unilateral suitcase carry or a bottoms up carry, and then take 4 or 5 days off. Now that was easy for a power lifter's mindset. If you give that to a combat athlete, they'll say, what? I got to train every day. No, you will not mechanostimulate the bone to fill in with the way Brian did. So there was a lot of scientific perspectives that went into that thought process. And of course, it was an experiment in progress. Does it work all the time? Of course not. So, you know, I can say with Brian, he was very disciplined in adhering to the program designed to stimulate what we had measured in the assessment, including the medical images. He probably is genetically gifted and predisposed. He moved very, very well and didn't break off the weak chemical bonds of the new bony callus we were trying to perform. So the stars aligned, and that's all I can really say about that. But it was taking a lot of little bits of science and putting it together with a extremely unique and disciplined individual.
Let me add
how do you answer that, Brian?
Well, the scientific aspect is, you know, I would just be regurgitating things I've learned from you with that. Couple points for people to remember during this process in those 4 years. Granted, I was rehabbing the first year and a half. I was coming back, but I was still lifting. But those 3 years after that, I'm lifting heavy and competing 1,000, 1,100 pound squats 20 or 30 times a year minimum. So it wasn't that I went sedentary and just became a normal average Joe after that time. I loaded with human limits during that time as my body was ready. After that first year, 18 months, I continue to build more and more capacity. So it isn't like I just quit lifting. I helped continue to stimulate with heavy lifting, but still honored movement patterns with spine hygiene, core work, and I didn't train multiple times a week with heavy compound movements. Once a week, sometimes every 2 weeks, I would squat heavy. So I want those caveats to be in there. Number one, we didn't just become a lay person and just retire. I built it back while remaining pain-free and symptom-free and hitting world records. And the second part being, of course, I adhered to the program still during this time.
It's fantastic, gentlemen. That is an amazing, amazing conversation. I'm so grateful. If I could just really quickly recap what's on the top of my mind. We've spoken about articulated linkage, neural drive, body and mind connection. We talked about programming and physiology. And I just want to leave this with one more critical point that I think all of us share. And those are great, great wives. Do you want to comment on that?
My wife came up with me to see Dr. McGill. She was there with me. She recorded the information. And that's one common trait I see with people that come to see me for their back, whether they're an athlete, an average Joe, an older person that's trying to get the last 20 years of their life pain-free. When they bring their significant other, their rate of success goes up. I don't have a number for you or anything, but I know when they're recording and they're taking notes and they're bought in as well, then their chance of recovery goes up. My wife came with me. She went up to see Dr. McGill. It was awesome. She supported me the whole time, and she's still by my side. We've been married for 13 years now. And yeah, I wouldn't be here without my wife, Rhea. She's awesome.
That's so funny. That's another parallel. So I'm married for 14 years now. My journey started in 99. I also wanted to be a policeman at some point. That's fantastic. And I've seen couples come into Professor Stu's clinic, and I think he'll say the same thing. He'll give them instructions and he'll say, make sure when you're giving them cues, it's one word, or else it derails into an argument.
Well, that's true. I need the spouse to have free license to nag the injured person, but to do it in a way that builds their relationship rather than tears it down or adds
Absolutely.
additional stress. Yeah.
So emotional stability, I would make the last and the fifth pillar of today's conversation. I guess wives do a great job supporting us. And speaking of one-liners, I remember the prof saying, our job is to make them laugh. Their job is to make sure we don't kill ourselves. I think that's very appropriate for this conversation.
That's very much the role of the women for us three. For sure, they keep us from doing stupid things that would otherwise kill us. I agree with that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. I just wanted to finish with a couple of plugs. Um, Brian, you're coaching people quite a lot now, so maybe you can tell us how to get in touch with you, who your typical clientele is. I'm assuming that you get a lot of lifters coming to you when they have bad backs. So please go ahead and tell us where we can find you.
Well, you can go to my website, poweractstrength.com, and I do online consults and in-person assessments. And I work with everybody. It started off just mainly power lifters, but now a lot of average Joes look to me when they see that page 41 in gift of injury, and they see the before and after, and they're like, this dude was able to come back, squat 1,300 pounds, supposedly remains symptom and pain-free to this day. I just want to be able to go and play pickleball. I just want to be able to go and play volleyball or whatever it is it may be. So they want me because they see that if I'm able to do that, then certainly they can get back to doing what they want to do. And that's way less dangerous. So I work with men and women of all sizes, shapes, and backgrounds. I, of course, love the athletes, but I love the average Joe as well, too. So you can find me at poweractstrength.com, and my email is brian@poweractstrength.com.
Fantastic. Professor, backfitpro.com.
Yes, you two are both on it as certified clinicians in our approaches and patients. There's two portals. One is if you are a clinician or a coach, you enter the website through one door, and if you're a pained person, you enter it through another door, and it helps you find people trained in your area. And as you know, in Central Europe, Paul, you get referrals through our website. And Brian, I know we send all sorts of patients to you as well. And I have to say this, thank you so much for making us look good with your professionalism and your track record for helping people. We're all hurting just a little bit on the inside, some more than others. And that, at the end of the day, is what this is all about. If we can help someone who's hurting that we can possibly intervene on, it doesn't get any better than that in terms of a higher calling.
Comments to that, absolutely.
And then if I could just plug one thing real quick, and that's 100% recommend people out there that have not done the online McGill 1, 2, and 3 courses. Absolutely do that. If you're thinking about you want to go in deeper, you have a friend that's in back pain, you're in back pain. I go through them all the time myself. And Stu, you have a big monster course coming up in Texas, don't you?
Yes. It's a hybrid model where people take 50 hours of online training, and then we all meet together live in person for 3 days where we hone our hands-on skills of assessment and working on people to improve our success in helping them with their back pain.
And they can get both of that information on BackFit Pro, correct?
Yes, it's all there. Yeah.
It's really grown into a fantastic community over the years. I'm really grateful that we're able to see each other online once in a while and share case studies. learn from that and from one another and discuss the fine-tuning of the branching logic, as you call it. So that's wonderful. There's also an amazing master's class that is a weekend class in your home in Gravenhurst, and that's just an absolutely amazing experience for everybody that comes. So I highly recommend that. Um, and for anybody that basically reaches out to me and asks, are these courses worth it? Well, they were a game changer to me. Like I said, the last piece of the puzzle that I had been building my entire life. So I'm forever grateful and forever loyal to you for that. Thank you so much. And also, not everyone gets to see the prof dive to pick up their, 7-year-old's fishing rod from the depths of T Lake. So that will always be etched in the memory of my mind. That and making slingshots with my little boy, I will be forever uh, remembering that experience. So thank you so
I,
much for
I,
everything that
I
you've done
do
for our
enjoy the
whole.
old crafts and passing them on to the youngsters. That's
Yes,
another great joy.
yes, indeed, absolutely. So with that, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Galactica Publishing for putting out our book in Poland, and also Kuba Sitar, who played a instrumental role in helping with the translation, and also has previously interviewed the two of you. Also Pocztanga PL. They're a powerlifting group that is promoting your work in Poland. They actually organized the event at which we had the book release. So these are fantastic people that we hope to be working with into the future. And on that note, actually, I want to leave with one question. I know that Professor's not traveling as much nowadays, but is able to drop in on Zoom when there are schoolings abroad. But I was having this idea recently with my friends that perhaps it wouldn't be a bad idea to get into the same room somebody like Brian and maybe Joel or Edward. And the reason I thought about this is because I've taken those courses a number of times now. And of course, the way you teach, Professor, is fantastic. However, having your students teach the course, it offers you a different perspective or different way of looking at your work. So being, the head of the program and the system is one thing, but also having learned from you and having a different experience, such as a chiropractor or a trainer, those people are able to um, transmit that information in slightly different, subtle ways. Not better or worse, but just each brain can absorb differently. So I highly recommend to people take those courses multiple times with different lectors, and you might catch different nuances. And
They're better.
so if we were to put, Brian and Joel or Brian and Edward into one room, I think that would be just magic. And we could probably fill that between, delegates from Central and Eastern Europe, right into Western Europe. So I would be really grateful for that kind of opportunity going forward into the future.
Okay, well, we'll try and make that happen.
Sounds
Fantastic,
good.
gentlemen. Great pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much for your
Okay,
time.
thank you so much,
Thank you.
Paul, and good to see you, Brian.
Good to see you, sir.
Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.